I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. We have with us back on The Truth of the Matter one of my all-time favorite guests. It is Mr. Timothy Shriver, who is the head, of course, of Special Olympics. But Tim isn't here to talk about Special Olympics today. He is here to talk about his incredible new podcast, which is coming out September 30th on Apple, Spotify, everywhere you get your podcasts. It's called Need a Lift. And I want to ask Tim to tell us in his words, what is this podcast about? I've listened to the trailer. I'm super excited. Tell me what gave you this idea.
Well, first of all, the music is the best part of it.
Awesome.
The music is the best part of it. We got a great song. When a colleague of mine, Andy Ogden, a couple of months ago said, let me write some music. I was like, okay, fine. You want to write the music? Anyway, it's fantastic. We got a studio down in Nashville to record it. So yeah, we're going to have a hit single out of this podcast.
It's incredible.
Here's the story, Andrew. I mean, you say I'm not here to talk about Special Olympics. You're right. But I am here to try to remind us, my listeners, our listeners, your listeners, that in this country, there is a deep well of conviction around doing good things for each other. That the Special Olympics movement is one great example of Republicans and Democrats, of Lions and Rotarians, of Heartland and Coastland, black and white, rich and poor, coming together because they see a need. So on Saturday morning, they show up at the track, at the pool, at the mountain. They see a need, they see an opportunity to make a difference in someone else's life, and they feel better about themselves when they are giving themselves to others. That's the story I got to watch for 30 years. Going to almost every state in the country, to high schools and elementary schools, to park rec departments and university fields, and then going around the world and seeing it in China and Syria and Israel and parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and Europe, all these places where the same spirit exists, people willing to give deeply of themselves when given the chance to make better. Now, here's the point. Today, where do you go to get that message? I'm sorry to say, you're not going to find it on partisan news. You're not going to find it if the algorithm is to be trusted to give you the most contemptuous story possible. You're not going to find it more often than not from our political leaders. You're going to find mostly name-calling, mostly dehumanizing contempt, mostly devotional anger, mostly toxins. So I was watching this and I was thinking to myself, hey, that's not us. Stop demeaning the American people. Stop demeaning the goodness that goes on in families and communities and faith-based institutions around this country. Elevate the stories of those people who are reminding us of the best of us. So that's what I'm trying to do. And, we've already recorded a bunch of these and, these people are fantastic. You talk about people struggling with addiction. It's a serious issue. Killian No has been working with people struggling from addiction, building recovery cafes all over the country. She's a rock star. She's just so inspiring. You talk about people who are, wanting to be successful and try again, even if their star hasn't risen yet. I got to talk to Michael Phelps and his wife, Nicole, and they just give this classic set of lessons on how to get your inner life, strong enough that you want to try again.
Can't wait to hear that.
And the list goes on and on. They're just Simon Sinek on how to have trust and confidence in service, and talking about the military. And I've just been so blown away by, Reverend Jen Bailey and Loretta Claiborne, the Special Olympics athlete who has nothing that most people think they need. No economic strength, a woman with an intellectual disability. And she's so generous and so engaged in making a difference and so joyful. And she tells you how. She on this podcast, she says, this is how I do it. And I hang up after these interviews, Andrew, and I go, I don't know if anyone's going to listen to this, but this stuff is fantastic. And it's what I've been hungry for. And I think a lot of Americans are hungry for it too.
I think so too. And I think people are going to jump on this podcast. And when you have people like that, of course, I'm a huge fan of Michael Phelps, the greatest swimmer of all time, of course, from our home state of Maryland. Everybody knows the two greatest swimmers of all time are from your and my home state of Maryland, Katie Ledecky, of course, and Michael Phelps. But that goes without saying. The cool thing about both of those people, like, others that you're going to be interviewing and have interviewed, is they do give back and they do want to help others lift up. And that's really been, you alluded to this, that's really been absent in the last couple of election cycles, hasn't it? I mean, our policymakers, we always say, and I teach this at my class at USC, is that a lot of policymakers think their job is to go on partisan television and talk and to get into their partisan ecosystems where viewers and listeners and readers don't go to their places to get news and information anymore. They go to get ammunition.
That, and they don't go to get things done. They go to make, a point, not a difference. They go to get clicks, to get change. They go to advance a partisan agenda, not to solve a problem for the country. And I'm sorry to say that has become the pattern. And I've talked to many members of Congress and Senate, and I talked to people in various state legislatures, and they're tired of it. They know this is what sells. They know it's what helps them raise money. And they also know it's what's destroying the very fabric of the country. And they're looking for a way out. So we've got to really almost create not just a podcast, but a constituency of people who will say to political figures and policymakers and all these people who have lots of influence and power and control, hey guys, we don't want that anymore. You don't win a debate if you demean the other person. You win a debate if you prove to us you can bring us together. How about that as a question? How are you going to do that? What's your formula? Problem solving with the other side. How do you think of yourself as a leader who listens deeply in order to understand best of the other side? How do you bridge gaps when gaps exist? How do you fight for your principles but not dehumanize people who have different principles from? Those are the questions citizens, I think, are starving to hear answered, but we don't get them asked or answered when we allow ourselves to devolve into this dehumanizing contempt, almost outrage industrial complex. And the toll of that is serious. I know you've seen this, Andrew, but the depression in our country, the loneliness in our country, the lack of conviction about our country's capacity to solve problems, the fear that things are getting worse and not better. These are all symptoms of this toxin of contempt and dehumanization that I see almost everywhere. And, if you get up in the morning and you pour poison into your bloodstream, you're going to have a bad day. A lot of people get up in the morning and they turn on their phones or their televisions and they pour poison right into their hearts. And so they end up frustrated and disappointed, and not surprisingly so. So we got to tune that stuff out and tune something else in. And so, hey, we're giving people a chance to tune in to something and people who I think will really inspire people. And it's not something, a podcast can't solve this whole problem, but can be part of a solution that other people will embrace. That's my hope. My hope is people will listen to this and go, you know what? We should do this at our school. You know what? We can do this in our university. You know what? We should do? Our company should have a podcast that's bringing out the lift that people, somebody on the assembly line or somebody in sales or somebody in finance or somebody in marketing is doing a great job. Let's have a podcast about those people instead of just water cooler conversations about who's a jerk, which manager is the biggest pain in the neck, and so on and so forth. So anyway, cultures can change, and we could change this. We don't have to live with this level of dehumanization of each other. It's not healthy. It's not getting things done. It's not making us richer, better, more powerful, happier. It's bad for our mental health. It's bad for everything. So we got to figure out a way out of it. This is our effort to.
It's a really good way of putting it, Tim. And I wonder, we do feel like a nation right now that's down in the dumps. And you see a lot of people wherever you go, especially if you travel too, and you get outside the Beltway and you get to different places off the East Coast, you see people who are hurting, but you also see people who don't seem to have a lot of hope and they don't seem to know where to turn to. Is that what you're finding?
I think they have hope, but they don't know where to turn to. They don't know where their community is. I mean, I think almost the most quintessential American quality is sort of an hopeful optimism about the future. Like Europeans sometimes make fun of us for that, right? Oh, you're so naive. You're so idealistic. It's almost childish. They almost demean us. Like, you're so hopeful, Americans. But that's us. That's us. Even when we've made huge mistakes as a country, somehow, best of us somehow often finds a way to persevere through it and try. Oh my God, that's us. We can solve this problem.
Yeah. I call it, we're like the next play country. You struck out. Hey,
Yeah.
next play, right?
Yeah.
That's who
go.
we are.
That's us.
Us.
So I think that's who we are. But if you say to people who feel that way, as I do, and I think you do too, where's your community? Who's your party? What's your station? What's your brand? What's the identity? I don't know. I don't know. It's not that far. No, I'm not sure. So we've got to kind of create a little bit of a groundswell. You know, these things, movements start small. They always do. And I'm certainly not the only one on this movement. There's lots, thousands, millions of Americans actually, I think, are actually doing this in their own small way. They're lifting each other up and they're saying, no, in the face of all that discouragement, Stan, in this community, in this faith-based institution, in this Rotary Club, in this Lions Club, we serve. You know, you go to a Lions Club meeting, everybody's in the room, and they have one thing in common. We serve.
Yeah.
And they go, you know, every week, every month, they raise money, they volunteer, they show up, and they serve. Now, for God's sakes, why aren't we putting them on, elevating them as political figures and elevating them as cultural icons? Not because we necessarily agree on everything, but because service is American. So I think there's a lot of people out there looking. They're not sure they can find it, but if they could find it, a home that's not exhausting, it's not full of contempt, it's not full of hostility, a place where they could reliably go to get smart information from compassionate people who are working hard and making a difference and changing the world. I think there's hundreds of millions of Americans who would opt for that.
You know, during COVID, my colleague and I, Steve Morrison, always talked about how, the best information you're going to get is from your doctor who you trust, right? What role do you believe that spirituality and religion and other types of community-based organizations can play in this? Because it certainly seems to me that when you get to the local level, we don't trust each other nationally anymore in politics, but you get down to the local level and there is bipartisanship. People do want to address the problems in their communities. They want to fix the roads. They want to fix the hospital. They want to make sure their schools are good. What role do you think some of these community and faith-based institutions and really spiritual institutions can play?
Well, I think they're essential, and I think they've always have been essential in the American story. I'll go back to the Special Olympics version of this. You know, we wouldn't have inclusive schools if it weren't for the volunteers in this country who said, we want our kids to play together with kids who have Down syndrome or autism or other forms of intellectual or developmental. Those volunteers in those neighborhood communities and those faith-based institutions, they led that revolution. And a lot of times they were young, they were 15, 17 years old. And they built a whole movement in the 70s and 80s, now into the 90s. And I visit schools still to this day. They're committed to the idea of making our country more welcoming for people who have intellectual disabilities. You can't stop them. Public policy couldn't stop them. Not to say public policy would want to. And I do think there's a spirituality to this. You mentioned it several times. I think we don't agree. We don't have a lot in common on, let's just say, Israel and Palestine or the border. We don't necessarily agree on a lot of these things. But at the deepest level, there we can meet each other. On our deepest hunger, we all want to be seen. We all want to matter. We all want to believe we have a purpose in life. We all want to find a community in which we feel safe. We all want to trust that there's something bigger than us. Right? These are just basic things. And if I listen to someone who's very different from me on, let's say, guns or border, if I listen deeply to her or his story, I'll find something that resonates with my story. I know it because at a deep level, we have a very shared story. Many people say, look, well, keep politics out of religion. I agree. Keep religion out of politics. That makes sense to me. But I don't think it necessarily makes sense to keep spirituality out of politics.
Yeah, there's a distinction.
Yeah. The spirituality is not bound by a particular faith tradition, a particular professional idea, or particular devotional prayers. Spirituality is more what comes from the inside as opposed to the ideas or words that come outside. And at the inside level, at the level of the inner life, the spiritual traditions, the traditions that teach us silence and teach us deep listening and teach us compassion and teach us kindness. These are things that we really need. And I think make our lives much.
Tim, can you give me an example or just like preview for our listeners here? What are some of the, memorable stories you heard about spiritual practices transforming painful moments
Mm,
into real purpose?
yeah. Oh gosh, I don't want to say you got to listen, but you got to listen. Don't listen for me, by the way. Listen for the guests. Listen for Killian No. She was a young graduate student in living in Washington, met several people in faith communities that inspired her to want to work with people that are very much on the front lines of addiction and poverty. And she started these recovery cafes. And I said to her, Killian, what's your practice? And she said, oh, she has this very beguiling kind of simplicity. Oh, I think about that. And she says, but what I try to do is remember, I'll paraphrase here, that in any given moment, I can practice return to my center, return to my safety, return to my core, return to my soul. So I have a practice of return in any conflict. If someone walks through the door and it tells me horrible news about we've lost someone, or there's been a terrible accident, or someone's fallen, I can practice return. Just a beautiful, and she explains how she does that. Or I can go to Michael Phelps saying, how he goes to the gym when he needs it, when he feels down. He's he's very open about his depression and his anxiety. And yes, 28 medals. I mean, which is just a stunning number of Olympic
Greatest
medals.
athlete of the century this year, they
I
named
mean,
him.
it's unbelievable. But he struggles with his inner pain, and he struggles with being discouraged, and he struggles with not trusting people. But he describes on the podcast how to keep himself healthy, how his relationships work, how he talks to his wife, Nicole, is on there, and she models listening to him and helping him through the days when it's just not working. Talks about his children, how they help him, and sometimes how they know him better than he knows himself. But at the end of it, you're like, okay, this is a formula I could use. Like, I'm not going to become Michael Phelps, but I could do what he's describing. Yeah, it needs to be done. Loretta Claiborne is a Special Olympics athlete. He talks about, when she gets down, she goes and volunteers and knits little cap, little infant caps for premature children. So that any mom who delivers a baby prematurely, who has to be in the newborn intensive care unit, gets a custom made, homemade, handmade little beanie, she calls them. She sends them to hospitals all over America. No one knows they come from her, but everyone is made by hand, and everyone carries her love for that little child, that little baby, and the mom. So, these are just beautiful little practices. Of Father Mike Schmitz told me, hey, I think it's at 4 o'clock in the morning he goes into the chapel every day. And part of his prayer routine is a very traditional Catholic set of prayers. Then there's a silence practice where there's no noise, where there's no thought, where there's a return, a place without thoughts to let your thoughts go. It sounds like mindfulness. And this is every morning for an hour and a half. And, so again, we're not all going to become Catholic priests. We're not all going to become an Olympic athlete, but these people are giving us gems. At least for me, I'm furiously writing notes, and then I send notes to my children. I share this with my wife, and it's just been wonderful to hear people talk from, I dare say, a spiritual level about ways to solve practical problems that are very much resonant for all of us.
I think I'm hearing maybe a common theme that you're getting from talking to these various people. It's about participation in things, isn't it?
It is in some ways. It's about, don't give up. This is the great, I think, challenge in some ways that many of us face. People that have been wounded by love are tempted to give up. Better to stay on my own. People have believed in the country and been disappointed by her. Give up. Don't take another chance that you're going to be hurt that much. People who have tried in their careers to move forward and it didn't work, give up. Just be content with some. All of these people have faced exact moments like all those: depression, failure in life, sadness, rejection. But if there's one thing they have in common, they don't give up. They give it another shot. They try again. And I think, that's easier said than done. I mean, I think we know a lot of people, and we maybe have each felt moments when, that just wouldn't resonate. I mean, I know there have been moments when I'm just like, okay, I got nothing left. I'm done. I got nothing left in my tank. And that's a real feeling. And it's in some ways a national feeling now. And it's in moments like that where someone comes and knocks on our door, opens the door and says, hey, Tim, I got something. You got to take a chance. Come on, let's go. Okay, maybe not today. I'm coming back tomorrow. You got to take a chance on this. You can't, you can't stay locked up. As one of my great role models, Martha Beck, said, you'll never be hurt as much by being open as you will be by being closed. So, sometimes it's hard to take a chance on each other. But all these people give us really practical and very inspiring strategies for how.
I keep thinking about the time we're in right now. It reminds me of Jimmy Carter and the Malaise speech. So many things were going wrong, and people, were walking around with their heads down and weren't thinking about, the next play. Do you think we've got a chance to pull out of that? I mean, we always have a chance in America, but like we're getting ready to have a really close, maybe even contentious election, hopefully not contentious. We have families who are breaking apart over politics and issues in this country. We have friends who are, won't speak to each other anymore and forgot that why they were friends in the first place, maybe forgot that they had something in common. Where do you think we're going?
Well, look, I think a lot of your listeners are interested in hard-nosed policy ideas and really well thought through researched ideas. Here's what we've concluded based on a lot of analysis of the polling data and a lot of analysis of scholarship. We don't have a problem of differences of opinion. We have a problem of contempt. We've seen the data on this from polling. We've seen comparables from places like South Africa and the Balkans and Northern Ireland in the midst of deep conflicts. Problem is not always whether we agree or not on gun rights or the reproductive rights, whatever it is. Problem is how we treat each other when we disagree. So that's a contempt problem. And our view is that the scholarship supports that if we don't solve the contempt problem, we can't solve policy option problems. Now, there's an antidote to contempt. Again, well researched here. I won't bore you with scholarship, but just so your listeners know, we're not just winging it here. The antidote to contempt is treating people with dignity. Donna Hicks up at Harvard has written about this. Desmond Tutu practiced it in the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa. We've seen this even in the Marshall Plan after World War II. Treating people on the other side of a conflict, even people who have been violently associated with killing or being at war with your side, treating them with dignity allows trigger mechanism to go on both internally and culturally that allows the healing to begin. So we have a contempt problem. We have a dignity antidote. Contempt hides by disguise. Most people don't think they're contemptuous. You know who they think are contemptuous? The other guys, right? So in your family, maybe, your cousin who's locking herself or himself out of the conversation thinks that you're being contemptuous. And of course, most of us, he's being contemptuous. So we've got to see our own participation and try to change ourselves. We have to tune it out and turn it off and try to change, try to, in a way, raise our scores. The third point I'll make briefly is we built a way to score this. So it's not just a conceptual thing. It's not just Tim, Shriver sounding like he wants to be a preacher or something like that. We have a way of scoring contempt and dignity in public discourse. We call it the Dignity Index. Now, the reason this is important is because people need practical tools to shift the culture. You ask, can we shift the culture? Yes, we can. We need practical tools, we need leaders, and we need communities that want to move in a different direction. And the Dignity Index, and I hope Need a Lift, this podcast, will help us with all three. Who are the leaders? How do we build constituencies around change? And how do we track and measure ourselves so that we know whether we're getting better?
Tim, we do need a lift, but we are the United States, and we will always continue to hopefully see the good in each other. Thank you so much for this. And I can't wait for September 30th. It's just a few days away when the first episode comes out of Need a Lift. So thanks for coming on and previewing it for us, because this is good stuff.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. And I always appreciate the voice you bring to public discourse. It's so desperately needed and so deeply appreciated.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.